it is unlikely that I will be willing to pay as much to keep you from using drugs as you will be willing to pay to be able to use drugs if you want to use drugs, and ditto for all the other victimless crimes. And therefore, it would be surprising, though not impossible, if such a market generated such laws. But it could, if you imagine, if people's feelings are strong enough. That's why I like to say that anarcho-capitalism is not by definition libertarian. That anarcho-capitalism is libertarian is a prediction, not a definition.
If anarcho-capitalism is not by definition libertarian, then it is incoherent as an ideology. Now, the man that you heard speaking in that interview is David Friedman, and he is a pretty prominent advocate for anarcho-capitalism. You may know him as the son of Milton Friedman, who was a very well-known economist, who was more of a conservative, but he had a lot sort of libertarian leanings. Now, the problem with anarcho-capitalism is quite well demonstrated by that little excerpt of that interview with David Friedman, where he talks about how he believes anarcho-capitalism would be a good path to a libertarian society, which is what he describes as a prescriptively libertarian. But it's not necessarily a libertarian society. It's not definitionally libertarian. Basically, he's saying that a anarcho-capitalism society could exist that's not libertarian. And he gave the example of how drug laws could, in theory, exist. Now, it's obviously important to accept that he does think that they would be unlikely, because he doesn't view it as something that would motivate people to, the example he gives there is that it's unlikely that it would be worth his while to spend money preventing other people from taking drugs. So enforcing drug laws seems unlikely to him in an anarcho-capitalist society. Now, apart from the fact that I think that's a little bit of a naive outlook with regards to whether the enforcement of drug laws would be profitable for a person, because obviously they're profitable in today's society for certain interests. But the other problem is if an anarcho-capitalist society could exist where drug laws, for example, are enforced, then that society is violating self-ownership and violating the non-aggression principle. Yet an anarcho-capitalist is built on those same concepts. I mean, anarcho-capitalism depends on the concepts of property rights, and a free market would be defined by those property rights. Now, property rights themselves come from self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, so it seems counterintuitive and self-contradicting for a society to be based on property rights, but then violate the exact concepts and principles that those very property rights are built on. So now it's important to also understand that just because David Friedman is a very prominent anarcho-capitalist, that doesn't mean that he speaks for all anarcho-capitalists. And I have spoken to many anarcho-capitalists that would insist that David Friedman is wrong in his assertion, and would insist that anarcho-capitalism is definitionally libertarian. In fact, voluntarism, which is the ideology that I represent through the Nations of Sanity project, is often described as a synonym for anarcho-capitalism. Now, I would dispute that assertion because anarcho-capitalism specifies an economic preference, whereas voluntarism doesn't. But the way I've always looked at it was to say that you don't have to be an anarcho-capitalist to be a voluntarist, but you do have to be a voluntarist to be an anarcho-capitalist. Unfortunately, the way David Friedman conceptualizes anarcho-capitalism, you don't have to be a voluntarist to be an anarcho-capitalist. And the problem with this form of anarcho-capitalism is that it violates the very principles and concepts that it claims to invoke. That being the concept of self-ownership, the non-aggression principle, and basic property rights. An anarcho-capitalist society, that has drug laws enforced on people is violating self-ownership, is violating the non-aggression principle, and violating property rights. Therefore, such a society would be self-contradicting, and such an ideology that advocates that would be, as I say, incoherent. So that's the problem with anarcho-capitalism, is the way in which it's poorly defined, to the point that even someone as prominent as David Friedman can be of the position that anarcho-capitalism could, in theory, exist in a way that violates libertarian principles. And whereas other anarcho-capitalists would argue that this is not an accurate description of what anarcho-capitalism is. The reason why I think voluntarism is such a better term, apart from the fact that it doesn't involve dedicating yourself to a specific economic preference, is that it is also more explicit in the fact that it cannot violate self-ownership, cannot violate the non-aggression principle, and cannot violate property rights. Because voluntarism is only focused on that basic ethos that all interactions must be voluntary because everybody has right over only their own selves, then there isn't the potential for it to be misunderstood and altered in a way where it can violate those same principles. Whereas, unfortunately, with anarcho-capitalism, that's proven to be the case. As I say, it's not just, some random person online that calls himself an anarcho-capitalist who's trying to claim that it's not libertarian. We have David Friedman, who is one of the more prominent anarcho-capitalists out there, who is also claiming that it's not necessarily libertarian. And while he does think that it would probably lead to a libertarian society, it's not a definitional part of what anarcho-capitalism is. So basically what I'm saying is if you are an anarcho-capitalist and you subscribe to the David Friedman conceptualization of anarcho-capitalism, where it can at least theoretically exist in a way that violates libertarian principles, namely violating self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, then I would have to say that your ideology is no more moral than statism, which you oppose, and is no more coherent than communism, which you also oppose. And while it may, as David Friedman here asserts, lead to a libertarian society, I don't think it can function as a coherent ideology if it doesn't stay faithful to those principles. Now, as I say, there are other anarcho-capitalists who are going to come in and say that anarcho-capitalism is voluntarism, and if it ever violates self-ownership, then it no longer qualifies as being anarcho-capitalism. Now, for that conceptualization of anarcho-capitalism, then we have no problem. And voluntarism, which is what I represent through the Nations of Sanity project, can exist in many forms and many manifestations, and anarcho-capitalism is a legitimate version of voluntarism, providing that it is voluntarist. So this is why it's so important that we focus on voluntarism, because voluntarism doesn't demand that we dedicate ourselves to a specific economic preference. It doesn't demand any way of life. The only thing it demands is that we respect the basic concept of self-ownership, that nobody violates anybody else's right over their own self. As long as we all respect that basic concept and the moral principle that comes from it, namely the non-aggression principle, then we can all live in peace and we can all pursue different economic preferences, we can all pursue different ways of life peacefully, and we can all coexist peacefully because we are all on the same page over what is and isn't objectively defined as a crime. And then this is why the Nations of Sanity project has such an important idea, because our idea is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a universal peace agreement, so that we can have a truly free society with truly equal rights, where anarcho-capitalists can pursue free market options, where voluntary socialists can get together for collective solutions, and all other types of people can pursue all other types of ways of life in peace without violating anybody else.